In this lesson, we'll begin the process of adding some particle dynamics to our pod racer. Alright, so I'm going to pick up this lesson right where Delano left off with our animation portion of this training. So we have this pod racer that's moving along this path. Now what we want to do is start to use some of the particle dynamics features in 3ds Max to start to add some smoke and other things that are coming out from behind these different engines. Okay, so at the moment, this pod racer is moving along this path. Now, when it comes to actually setting up some of our different emitters and getting those positioned just right, this would probably be easier if we actually take this pod off of the path and pretty much get it right back to the center of our scene. So what I'm going to do is just press Alt-W on my keyboard to switch to a 4-panel view. Let's go into the top view. And let's just temporarily take this pod off of this path. So to do this, I'm just going to go over to my layers over here. I'm going to go into the default layer. This is actually the node that I want to get to, is this pod racer. So I'm just going to right click on that, select, and that will select this for me. Now I'm going to go over to this motion tab, go to the path constraint, and we'll take this constraint weight down to 0, so that way this path constraint has no effect whatsoever. So now, once we take a look at that, you can see now this pod racer is no longer on the path. As I scrub through the timeline, you can see there is no more effect. So when it comes to actually now setting up these different emitters for the particles, this will make it much easier to make sure that everything's nice and properly aligned. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and again press Alt-W on my keyboard, and this time I'm going to switch over to the front view. I'll go into the Create menu. Inside the Geometry, we'll pull down this Standard Primitives menu, and we'll switch this to Particle Systems. So you can see within 3ds Max that we do have a few different particle types to choose from. For this particular example, we're going to be using the Super Spray. So click on that, and then once we have this active, we can now start to draw out the emitter. And I'm going to draw this in my front view because this will actually now align this emitter to where the particles are moving toward me with this particular view. So once I have this, I'm just going to right click to exit this creation mode. Alright, and now if we were to take a look at one of these views, we can start to see this emitter. And what's really nice about the particle systems in 3ds Max is the fact that we really don't have to simulate anything in order to see the result. As long as we're scrubbing through the timeline, we can actually see what the behavior of these particles is going to be. So if you look very closely, you can start to see these little tick marks in my scene. Now just to make these a little bit easier to see, I'm going to turn off my grid. Just press the G key on my keyboard. Now let's take a few minutes to explore some of the parameters of these particles and start to get these set up and looking proper for us. So I'm going to switch to a 4-panel view, and again, just press the G key on my keyboard to turn off the grid in these different views, so that way it's just a little bit easier to start to see these particles themselves. So with this particle emitter selected, we'll go into the Modify menu, and here's our Super Spray. Now one of the first things I like to do, if your graphics card is able to handle it, is to go into this viewport display, and by default you can see it's only displaying about 10% of the total particle count. So what we see in the viewport as far as the actual particles is not actually what the total number of particles is. So whenever it comes time to actually setting up your particle behaviors and just making sure that you do have the proper number of particles, one of the first things I like to do is take this percentage and go ahead and bring that up to 100%. Right, now you can see at the moment that these particles are really just kind of shooting out in a straight line. So let's come in and start to make some adjustments to this. We can start to control the actual direction and the spread of our particles up here underneath this basic parameters rollout. So starting with this off axis, you can see as we start to rotate this around, essentially this can now start to rotate this either clockwise or counterclockwise depending on how we want to rotate the angle of our particle emission. Now below this we also have the spread. So what this will start to do is now begin spreading those particles out, spreading their emission out. So if we wanted to, let's say, expand these from 45 degrees, you can see that's pretty much what we're getting here. Now the thing to keep in mind is that while we are typing in 45 degrees, you'll notice this is actually more like a 90-degree chunk here. This would probably be 1/4 of a circle. So what this is actually stating is that instead of 45 degrees from corner to corner, this is actually extending 45 degrees out from its original point of emission. So from this line here This is now going to spread that 45 degrees out in this direction as well as 45 degrees out in this direction. So if we actually wanted this to emit out in more of a radial fashion, we would actually crank this spread up to 180 degrees. So that way, from this original line of emission, these particles are now spreading out 180 degrees in either direction. Right? And again, one of the things that you'll notice is that as we're starting to make these adjustments, we never have to re-simulate our particles. As soon as we can make this adjustment, that change gets displayed to us right in the viewport. So really, really nice as far as being able to control the actual look of our particles in pretty much real time. So let's come in here and start to add a little bit of spread to this. I'll start with something like 13 or 14 degrees. Now, you'll notice that that is only spreading it in one axis. If we look at this from the side view, you notice this is still a pretty straight line. So let's go ahead and go to the off plane as well. And this will pretty much allow us to start to control our spread and the distribution of our particles in this other axis as well. Right, so just essentially increasing that spread a little bit more just so we can get a little bit better distribution and scattering of these particles. Now, as we start to look at these, what you'll see is that these particles start to emit, and then after a certain point, they just cut off. So to control that, we just need to scroll down a little bit further and go into the particle generation rollout. So let's expand that. Here is where we can control the actual rate of our particle emission. So if we want just a handful of particles, we can begin to drop this rate down. If we want much tighter, much stronger distribution of particles, we can start to increase this and get really as many as we want. Now, what we want to start to control is right now the emission start and the emission stop. So you can see right now the emission stop is set to about 30 frames, which means at frame 30, you can see the emitter stops emitting any new particles, and at this point, now they start to die off. So in our animation, we really don't necessarily want these to cut off, so let's go ahead and have these particles emit through our entire timeline. So let's set the emission stop to about 150 frames. Now, you'll notice that at one point, these particles simply disappear. And that's because right now we have this display until option set to 100 frames. So once we pass frame 100, all of our particles are no longer displayed. So again, if we want to increase this to the entire length of our timeline, we can do that. Below this, we can start to control how long these particles live. So at this point, these particles, from the point at which they're born, will live until about 30 frames, at which point they will start to die. So if we wanted these particles to last longer and form a longer trail, we can start to increase this lifespan. So if we were to increase this to something like 50 frames, we can see that. And we can also start to add a little bit of variation. So if we don't necessarily want all of these particles to die at the exact same moment, we can start to create a little bit of variation. So if we were to increase this to something like 10, that means that now 10 frames either before or after this point in time is when we'll actually start to lose our particles. And you start to see that that creates a little bit more of an irregular, kind of more natural, random dying off of our particles. All right, so in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at some additional parameters for controlling the behavior, as well as starting to control the rendered appearance of these particles.